Frank Delaney didn't expect anything new to happen on a Wednesday. At 72, most of his days were carved from the same old wood, coffee brewed too weak, a recliner groaning under his weight, and the TV talking to no one in particular. His old house in central Pennsylvania was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the distant bark of someone else's dog. On this particular Wednesday, the 6 o'clock news was doing its usual shuffle between car crashes, economic forecasts, and politics until a segment came on that made Frank sit up just a little straighter. Elon Musk unveils first commercial Hyperloop tunnel in Las Vegas, the anchor said, standing beside a glowing animation of futuristic cars zipping through glowing tubes underground. It's a whole world beneath our feet, she added, built by people who dare to dream differently. Frank squinted at the screen. The footage showed Elon Musk standing in front of a crowd, grinning with boyish pride. Reporters threw questions at him. He answered with a mix of logic and madness, like a man who'd never accepted gravity as a final answer. Then came the quote, the one that froze Frank's hand halfway to his lukewarm mug. The future belongs to the bold. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. A memory rose up from the depths like an old miner's lamp, flickering but persistent. It was 1958. He was just a boy, knees scabbed, palms greasy with glue and dreams. In the dim light of his father's garage, he'd built a model he called the Underground Highway of Tomorrow, a cardboard loop painted silver, powered by a busted train motor and the blind faith of a child. His father, Frank Sr., had looked at it, scratched his head, and said, "Son, stick to shovels. Ain't no tunnels but coal shafts down here." That was the end of that. The model got boxed away. The dream buried deeper than the mines he'd spent most of his life in. Until now. Now, there was a man digging new tunnels, electric ones, not coal-stained. A man who didn't care how old an idea was, only how far it could go. Frank whispered into the dark, maybe the bold aren't all young. The next morning, Frank shuffled down to the basement, the smell of must and old paint hitting him like a ghost. He hadn't been down here in years. The shelves were lined with cans of hardened glue, rusted tools, and dust thick enough to write regrets in. He opened a long-forgotten box labeled, Frank Jr., Projects. There it was. The Underground Highway of Tomorrow. The silver paint had faded, the motor was long dead, but the bones of the thing were still intact. He held it like it was sacred, like it was a piece of himself he'd forgotten existed. Upstairs, the TV droned on. A newscaster asked, "Is this the future of urban transportation?" Frank wasn't sure about cities. But he knew one thing, his future wasn't over. That same day, he opened his laptop for the first time in months. The screen flickered to life with the slow grace of old age. He typed Elon Musk tunnel system and fell down a digital rabbit hole. Hyperloop. Boring company. Vacuum trains. Tunnel boring machines. He watched interview after interview, hypnotized. One clip had Musk sitting on a stool, eyes blazing, hands dancing in the air as he spoke. "Why not?" he said. "Why not dig deeper, go faster, dream bigger?" Frank sat back, heart thudding. It wasn't the machines. It wasn't the technology. It was the attitude. The refusal to stop dreaming. That night, over a microwaved Salisbury steak, Frank made a decision. He would rebuild his model. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because he thought it would change the world. But because he needed to remember who he used to be before the world told him to stop trying. Before his knees went bad. Before Helen passed. Before he became invisible. He needed to remember what it felt like to dream out loud. He ordered a 3D printer. He had no idea how to use it. Didn't matter. He watched a video tutorial that made him feel like he was reading ancient Egyptian, but he watched it again. And again. He went to the hardware store for the first time in years. The young clerk asked, "What are you building?" Frank smiled with the weariness of a man who'd lived too long with silence. Something people forgot to dream about. The kid blinked, then grinned. Cool. That one word lingered in Frank's chest longer than expected. Later that week, the printer arrived. The delivery guy was a tall kid with an undercut and a SpaceX hoodie. His name tag said, Mason. Need help setting it up? He asked. Frank hesitated, pride wrestling with confusion. Yeah, maybe just a bit. Mason stepped inside, looking around the time capsule of Frank's living room. Wood paneling, plastic-covered couch, a photo of Helen in her Sunday dress. You live alone? Mason asked, unwrapping the printer. Not always, Frank replied. Mason didn't pry. He just started clicking parts into place. They ended up talking about tunnels, about coal mining, about how Frank used to work underground when men still swung pickaxes. Mason pulled out his phone and filmed a short video. Guys, he said to the camera, meet Frank. He's 72 and building a tunnel system in his garage. Because why not? Frank laughed and waved awkwardly. I'm not building the future, he said, half joking. Just trying to remember mine. The video went viral overnight. Mason texted the link the next day. 500,000 views and counting. You're internet famous, old man. Frank watched himself on screen, uncomfortable but intrigued. The comments were mostly kind. Reminds me of my grandpa. Wish my dad would do something like this. This guy rocks. A few asked, can we help? He didn't know how to answer. But something inside him stirred. That night, he looked at the model again. The tunnel wasn't just about transportation. It was about rediscovery. Redemption. Relevance. He whispered to Helen's photo, you wouldn't believe this. For the first time in years, he looked forward to tomorrow. Because maybe, just maybe, there was still more road ahead. Not above ground. But deep, deep underneath. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Delaney woke the next morning with a stiffness in his bones that wasn't just physical. The aches were familiar, knees worn from decades of labor, hands curled with arthritis, a lower back that creaked like old timber, but the real weight sat deeper, in that part of the soul where time accumulates like dust. He moved slowly through his morning ritual, the same one he performed for years. Shuffle to the bathroom, shave while avoiding his own reflection, make toast he'd barely taste, and sit by the kitchen window watching a street that had long since forgotten him. Outside, the world kept moving. People in passing cars didn't glance his way. The mailman barely made eye contact. Neighbors waved with polite detachment, never stopping to talk. Frank had lived on this block since 1973, back when every lawn was mowed on Saturdays and barbecue smoke connected houses like invisible string. Now the lawns were uneven, the porches quiet, and the string was gone. His house, once vibrant with the clatter of family, echoed like a museum. The pictures on the walls told a story more alive than the man who dusted them. One showed Helen on their honeymoon in Wildwood, smiling so wide it made his chest hurt. Another captured Emily at age 10, missing 2 front teeth and holding a papier-mâché volcano they built together. She used to call him Dad the Builder. Now she just called on Christmas. Sometimes. Frank sat with his coffee, cold already, and stared at the microwave clock blinking 8:12. He couldn't remember why he got up this early anymore. No job to go to. No one expecting him. The stillness was not peaceful, it was sharp, like silence that pokes at your ribs. And yet, this was normal. This was the routine. After all, what else was there to do? He'd done the things expected of him. Married young. Worked hard. Took the night shift when others begged off. Bought the house with the peeling shutters. Raised a daughter, kept food on the table, paid off the Buick. He had always been dependable. Not remarkable, just reliable. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped asking for anything more. He used to dream, though. Long before life cornered him into obligations. As a boy, he was always building, wooden towers, radios from kits, a homemade telescope that barely worked but made him feel like a scientist. He'd draw fantastical blueprints of inventions that could change the world. One, he remembered clearly, was a system of tunnels beneath every major city, connecting people through sleek tubes powered by magnetism and imagination. He called it the Underground Highway of Tomorrow, scribbled in bold crayon letters. He showed it to his father once, proudly unrolling the long sheet of paper across the kitchen table. His dad, still in coal-dusted overalls, chuckled and said, "That's sweet, son. But real men don't build fantasy trains. They work with their hands, underground, for real." That one comment was like water on fire. The drawing was rolled up, placed in a box, and buried beneath years of growing up. And so Frank did what was expected. He became a miner like his father. Spent 4 decades in the dark, headlamp on, shoulders hunched, lungs filling with dust and resignation. He never hated it, but he never loved it either. It was survival. A paycheck. A purpose by default. Then came retirement, and purpose disappeared. Helen tried to fill the gap with crossword puzzles and church groups, but her cancer came like a thief, fast and ruthless. Frank was left alone in the silence that followed, the kind that settles into the walls like mold. Emily visited after the funeral, helped clean out Helen's things, and then left for Seattle. She'd built her own life, career, family, city lights. She loved him, he knew that, but distance grew roots. Calls became quick check-ins. Visits turned to obligations. He didn't blame her. Not really. People move forward. The old becomes scenery. Most days, Frank didn't fight it. He didn't rage against the quiet. He simply existed in it. But sometimes, late at night, the ache returned, not in his joints but in his chest. A longing so sharp it startled him. Not for Helen, though he missed her terribly. Not even for Emily, though her absence was a dull throb. What he missed most was himself, the version of Frank that believed he could build things that mattered. The boy who saw problems and imagined solutions. The kid who thought tunnels could be magical. He had forgotten how to be that boy. Forgotten what it felt like to start a project with no clear outcome, just passion and curiosity. Until yesterday. Until that quote. The future belongs to the bold. It wasn't just words. It was a challenge. A dare. A hand extended across time, asking him if he was really done yet. He wasn't sure of the answer, but he knew he wasn't ready to stop asking the question. That evening, he found himself back in the basement, holding that old model in his hands. It was crude, cardboard and tape, peeling paint, a motor that hadn't turned in 60 years. But it had soul. It held a piece of the boy he used to be. He turned it over slowly, inspecting the joins, the curves, the ambition. He whispered, almost reverently, "You're still here." Upstairs, the TV murmured in the background. Another segment on Elon Musk, this one showing young engineers cheering as a test pod zipped through a neon-lit tunnel at blistering speed. One of the engineers said, "We're making history underground." Frank smiled faintly. He knew that feeling once, when he was 20 and led a rescue team after a mine collapse. They saved 3 men that day. Crawled through shattered rock with only headlamps and grit. He remembered the darkness and the fear, but also the resolve, the absolute certainty that giving up wasn't an option. Maybe it still wasn't. Maybe that kind of resolve didn't retire. Maybe it just needed reminding. He went to his garage and flipped the switch on the overhead light. It buzzed to life, revealing a cluttered workbench, some rusted tools, and a lifetime of deferred dreams. He cleared the bench, gently laid the model down, and began taking measurements. His hands shook slightly, but the muscle memory was still there. He could still build. He could still make something. Not a real tunnel, of course, not one you could ride through, but a better version of the dream updated with what he now knew about airflow and support structures and weight balance. The knowledge hadn't left him. It had just gone quiet, like a dormant engine waiting for a spark. That night, Frank didn't eat dinner. He didn't turn on the TV. He stayed in the garage until midnight, sketching ideas on scrap paper, muttering to himself like a man possessed. And in that quiet moment, a shift occurred, not dramatic, not sudden, but powerful. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for time to pass. He was using it. That next morning, he ordered the 3D printer. It took him half an hour to figure out how to enter his card information. He cursed at the screen. Hit the wrong button twice. But he didn't quit. And when the confirmation email arrived, he laughed, a dry, surprised sound that echoed in the kitchen like joy. Something had awakened. Not ambition, exactly. Not even hope. Just the simple, radical truth that he wasn't finished. Not yet. He picked up the old model again, held it to his chest like a relic. "We're not done, you and me," he said softly. And he meant it. Frank Delaney didn't expect resistance from the outside world when he decided to start building again. He thought the hardest part would be the creaky knees, the stiff fingers, the learning curve of new technology, but as it turned out, some of the fiercest battles came from voices both outside and inside his own head, voices that questioned, doubted, dismissed, and whispered that this spark was a passing delusion, not a revival, and that maybe it was time to accept invisibility as a final stage of life, not a phase to fight through. It started at the doctor's office, where he'd gone to check out the swelling in his hands after wrestling with some of the 3D printer parts for 3 days straight. He sat on the sterile paper-covered bench while Dr. Mahoney, a man 20 years his junior with a clipboard and the expression of someone who'd already moved on to the next patient, peered over his glasses and said, "Frank, you need to slow down. Arthritis isn't something you can ignore at your age," to which Frank nodded politely, knowing there was no point in explaining that slowing down was exactly what had been killing him for years. On the way out, he ran into Shirley Hampton in the waiting room, a neighbor who used to know Helen from church, and she blinked when she saw him and said, "Frank? Oh wow, it's been so long. You still living all alone in that big old place," with a smile that wasn't quite concern, more like surprise that he still existed, and when he said, "Yeah, still puttering around," she chuckled and said, "Well, long as you're staying out of trouble," as if that was the best someone his age could aspire to. On the walk home, his mind turned against him, pulling up questions like weeds. What are you even doing this for? Who cares about a plastic tunnel? You're 72, not 17. You missed your chance. You don't know anything about technology. You're going to make a fool of yourself. But then, later that night, after he'd taken his evening pills and stared too long at the blank TV screen, he opened his laptop and found the clip again, the one where Elon Musk was talking about failure like it was just another ingredient in innovation, not something to fear, and he clicked play. The screen lit up with Musk's restless energy, his eyes darting like sparks, and he said, "Some people say we should only build things we know will work. That's how you get stuck. If you're not failing, you're not inventing," and Frank leaned forward slightly, as if those words were being spoken directly to him. He remembered the first time he'd gone down a coal shaft with his father, how terrifying it was, the closeness of the walls, the dampness, the air that seemed to sit heavy on your shoulders, and how his father had patted his back and said, "You get used to the dark," and he had, for decades, gotten used to the dark, both literal and metaphorical, but now he wondered if that had been a mistake. That weekend, he walked to the diner downtown, the one where he and Helen used to get Sunday pancakes, and as he stepped inside, the old bell above the door gave its familiar squeal and the scent of coffee and bacon filled the air. He found a booth in the corner, sat down, and waited for Rita, who'd been working there since forever, to shuffle over with her notepad. She looked him over, gave a small smirk, and said, "Frank Delaney, you still kicking?" And he smiled and nodded and said, trying to, and when she asked what he was up to these days, he paused a second too long before saying, just working on a little project at home. She raised an eyebrow. What kind of project? And he took a deep breath, realizing how silly it might sound, and said, I'm building a prototype tunnel system. Just a model, for now. Inspired by Elon Musk's Hyperloop. Her face went still for a second, then she let out a short laugh, not unkind, but surprised. You building a tunnel in your garage now? What's next, you flying to Mars? And he laughed too, even though it hurt a little. Not quite. Just building something I used to dream about. She shook her head, scribbled on her pad, and said, well, if you need extra syrup for that rocket fuel, let me know. The interaction stayed with him all day. Not because she'd meant any harm, but because it reminded him that people didn't expect much from someone his age beyond staying upright and maybe remembering to take their meds. That evening, as if summoned by fate, Mason stopped by again with a six-pack and a laptop under his arm. Brought some inspiration, he said, plopping down at the workbench. Frank showed him the updated sketches, the newer tunnel designs he'd been refining, and Mason whistled low. You actually upgraded the ventilation model. That's legit. Frank felt the glow of pride, quiet but real, and they spent the next hour reviewing blueprints, tweaking designs, and watching YouTube videos about magnetic propulsion. At one point, Mason pulled up another Elon clip, this one from a press conference where someone asked, but aren't you afraid people will think this is ridiculous? And Musk smiled and said, they already do. That's not a reason to stop. That's a reason to keep going. Frank watched the clip in silence, then said, you ever feel like your time's already passed? Mason leaned back in the chair, beer in hand, and said, honestly, I feel like mine hasn't started yet. But watching you, I think maybe time isn't the point. Maybe it's about direction. Frank nodded slowly. That night, the doubts came back, like they always did, but this time, they weren't as loud. He stood in front of the mirror in his hallway, looked at the lines in his face, the age spots on his hands, and whispered, you're not done. The next morning, he went to the library, which he hadn't done in years, and asked the young librarian to help him find books on structural engineering, magnetism, and airflow systems. She gave him a curious look but smiled and led him to the shelves. He checked out 7 books and carried them home like treasure. Later that week, the delivery man brought a package, an Arduino kit Mason had recommended, something that could help him simulate electronic systems, and Frank tore into it like a child on Christmas. He spent hours fiddling with the pieces, watching videos, cursing under his breath, and finally, at 2 a.m., got a tiny fan to spin using code he barely understood. He shouted into the empty garage, "Ha!" And for the first time in months, his laughter didn't feel like it had an expiration date. And then, just when things were starting to feel right, the letter came. It was from the township zoning office. Cease and desist activity that may constitute unlicensed construction or public infrastructure design. Frank stared at the envelope for a long time. It wasn't even that serious, just a boilerplate warning, probably triggered by Mason's viral video, but it stung. Like the world telling him, again, to stay in his lane. He brought the letter inside, set it on the kitchen table, and just stared at it. He thought about quitting. Thought about boxing everything up. Thought about calling Emily and telling her she'd been right to worry about him. But then, like a divine intervention, Mason texted him a tweet. It was from Elon Musk. The best ideas don't come from institutions. They come from crazy people with garages. Frank didn't respond to the text. He just got up, walked out to the garage, flipped on the lights, and sat down at the bench. He picked up a piece of plastic tubing and began sanding the edges, slow and steady. Outside, the sun dipped below the trees. Inside, Frank kept working, not because he had something to prove to the world, but because he was starting to remember how it felt to believe in himself. The inner war wasn't over, but he was learning how to fight it. Not with fists, not with arguments, but with action. One small piece at a time. One bold step forward. It started with a walk. Not a long one, not anything heroic or cinematic, just a walk to the edge of the neighborhood and back. Frank Delaney laced up his old sneakers, the ones with worn soles and frayed laces, and stepped outside into the late afternoon heat that clung to his skin like a second shirt. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks and rusted mailboxes. His knees protested. His ankles wobbled. But he kept going, one foot, then the other, each step defying the idea that old age was only about shrinking circles and staying indoors. It wasn't about getting fit or chasing youth. It was about motion. About saying, I'm still here. That small decision, that 1-mile loop, became part of his rhythm. Each evening he walked, and each evening he returned with something new, a spark of clarity, a fresh idea, a memory he thought he'd lost. One night, he remembered the smell of his father's garage, the way oil and sawdust mingled in the summer air. Another night, he thought about Emily's third-grade science fair, where she built a baking soda volcano and he stayed up all night painting the cardboard backdrop to look like Mount Vesuvius. He hadn't thought about that in years. The walks cleared the cobwebs. They unlocked doors in his mind he'd boarded up long ago. It was during one of those walks that he passed by the old middle school, shuttered now, the windows boarded, the flagpole rusted. A banner still hung from the fence, half torn, imagine. Inspire. Innovate. He stopped in front of it, staring at the words. Imagine, he muttered. That was the one he'd let go of first. He walked back home with a sense of urgency. That night, he returned to the garage and pulled out his sketchpad. His design was evolving. It wasn't just a recreation of his childhood model anymore. It was a blend of nostalgia and innovation. His old cardboard tunnel reimagined with modern materials, sensors, simulated airflow, even a tiny pod on a magnetic rail he'd pieced together from an old train set and parts Mason helped him 3D print. He began uploading pictures to a blog Mason had helped him set up. At first, it was just for himself, a digital scrapbook of sorts. He called it Frank's Tunnel. No fancy graphics. Just photos, diagrams, a few thoughts in shaky text. But something happened. People started reading. A few dozen at first. Then hundreds. Comments appeared, curious, encouraging, amazed. My dad would love this. Reminds me of my grandpa's old workshop. Keep going, Frank. One comment read, I'm 67. I thought I was done dreaming. You just gave me permission to try again. That one stopped him cold. He read it 3 times. Permission. That word hit like a sledgehammer. So many years wasted waiting for someone to say it was okay to matter again. To try. To change. He didn't realize until now that he could have given himself that permission all along. He printed the comment and taped it above his workbench. The blog kept growing. Local press picked it up. The headline read, Retired Miner Reimagines Tunnels of the Future. The article called him a modern-day Da Vinci of the basement. He chuckled at that. Emily called out of the blue. Dad, she said, her voice filled with surprise and emotion, you're kind of a thing now. He laughed. Apparently. There was a pause. Why didn't you tell me you were doing this? He hesitated. Didn't think anyone would care. I care, she said softly. I always cared. That night, they talked for an hour, about the project, about Helen, about Emily's kids and the way her youngest had started taking things apart just to see how they worked. Runs in the family, she said. Frank felt something warm bloom in his chest. The next day, he made his biggest change yet. He opened the old shed out back, the one that had once held bikes and lawn chairs and now just stored dust and raccoons, and decided to build a larger model. Not just the tunnel, but an entire city grid on plywood, streets, stations, transit hubs, all connected by tiny vacuum-sealed tubes running underneath. He mapped it out like a child planning a toy world, except this was no game. This was legacy. Every night, Mason stopped by to help. He brought tools, snacks, even other friends who knew more about wiring and code. Soon the garage and shed became a hive of activity, young and old, soldering wires, adjusting fans, programming Arduino chips. Frank wasn't just building a tunnel anymore. He was building a community. One evening, Mason sat down beside him, grease on his hands, and said, "You know this could be a prototype, right? Like, a real thing." Frank smiled. "I'm not trying to change the world." "Maybe not," Mason said. "But you might change someone's." 1 week later, a reporter from a regional tech magazine stopped by. She took photos, asked questions, listened intently as Frank explained airflow ratios and modular design. When she asked why he started, he looked at the floor for a long moment, then said, "Because I thought I was done. And then I realized I wasn't." The article went viral. Elon Musk retweeted it with the caption, "Innovation has no age limit. This guy gets it." Frank stared at the tweet for a full 5 minutes before whispering, "I'll be damned." The next morning, his email inbox was flooded. Offers. Invitations. Questions from engineers. Requests from teachers asking if they could use his blog in their classrooms. He even got a message from someone at the Boring Company, "We love what you're doing. Want to talk?" He didn't respond right away. He didn't want to get lost in the swirl of attention. He stayed grounded by walking. Still every day, still the same loop. Still stopping at the middle school fence and reading those words, imagine. Inspire. Innovate. One afternoon, he brought a can of white paint and a brush and touched up the letters himself. They gleamed under the sun. That night, he started a new post on his blog. It read, "I used to think purpose was something you had when you were young, when your hands worked and your calendar was full. But now I see purpose isn't tied to age or energy. It's tied to motion. You start moving towards something, even just a little, and life moves with you. All I did was build a tunnel. And somehow, I found a way out of the dark." He didn't know who would read it. He didn't care. What mattered was that it was true. Every word. He'd made one small choice, walking, then sketching, then building, and that single decision had cracked open a whole new season of his life. He wasn't done. Not even close. The tunnel, symbolic or literal, was real now. And it was his to finish. It wasn't the moment Frank Delaney expected. He didn't hear trumpets or see fireworks. No one knocked on his door offering a medal or an engineering contract. Instead, the moment he broke through, really broke through, came on a quiet Wednesday morning, with the smell of coffee in the air and a single, unread message sitting in his inbox. He had just come in from his walk, sweat on his brow, knees aching, but his head was clear. The same loop he walked every day, past the school, past the banner he'd repainted, past the porch where Shirley Hampton always sat knitting and waved politely. That day she actually called out, "Hey Tunnel Man, you changing the world yet?" He smiled, waved, said, "One tiny pipe at a time," and kept going. It was a joke now, in the neighborhood. People had started to notice the project. Not in a viral way, more in the way someone notices the first crocus breaking through snow. Quiet, persistent, unexpected. By the time he sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop, the coffee was lukewarm and the light coming through the window was warm with the promise of something. The subject line read, "From the office of E. Musk, personal message." He stared at it for nearly a full minute before clicking. The message was brief. Simple. "Frank, saw your models. Impressive vision. Would love for you to visit one of our sites. You're proof that courage has no retirement age. Stay bold. There was a contact number and a note, P.S. Loved the original loop design. He exhaled slowly. Then laughed. Then stood up and said out loud to no one, "You've got to be kidding me." And then he laughed harder. Not from disbelief, but from the joy of realizing this moment, this validation, didn't change what he already knew deep down, he mattered again. And not because Elon Musk noticed him. Not because of blog traffic or social media comments or news articles. It was because he had finally listened to that small, stubborn voice inside him that said, "Build it anyway." He printed the email, framed it, and hung it right above the model in the shed. He didn't call the number. Not yet. Not because he was afraid. But because the moment itself was enough. He needed to hold it close before it became a new chapter with new pressures. Instead, he walked into the garage and powered up the newest version of his tunnel prototype. The latest pod glided through the loop with a quiet hum, propelled by the tiny linear motor he and Mason had built over 3 long weekends. It wasn't perfect. But it worked. More than that, it made sense. Every piece was where it belonged. That evening, Mason arrived with 2 energy drinks and a grin that was almost too big for his face. "You saw the email?" Frank nodded, still slightly in awe. "You set this up?" "Not exactly," Mason said. "I tagged him in one of the updates. Didn't think he'd see it." "Well, he saw it," Frank said, still staring at the framed email like it was a window into another reality. Mason sat down at the bench, looked around at the tools, the sketches, the scent of oil and ambition thick in the air. "Frank, I think you did it." Frank turned. "Did what?" "Broke the wall," Mason said. "You know, the one most people don't even know is there. That invisible wall between who they used to be and who they still could be." Frank sat down slowly. "I didn't break the wall. I just stopped pretending it wasn't there." That night, they worked until midnight. No fanfare. No cameras. Just 2 generations, side by side, sanding, wiring, laughing, arguing over magnet strength and power load. And for the first time in years, Frank felt like he was contributing something real, something tangible. Not just for himself, but for someone else. For everyone else. 2 days later, he received a letter in the mail, handwritten, elegant paper, the return address from a high school across the state. "Dear Mr. Delaney," it began, "my name is Jasmine, I'm 17, and I read about your project online. I just want you to know that you helped me find my senior project topic. I didn't know engineering could be about dreams. Thank you for reminding me." She'd drawn a small tunnel system on the back of the letter, her own version of a loop, with little hearts instead of pods. Frank showed it to Mason. "Look at this," he said. "Look what happens when you don't give up." Mason nodded. "You gave her permission, too." A few days later, he finally called the number in the email. He was scheduled for a private tour of a boring company site in Nevada. They offered to fly him out, pay for the hotel, give him a full walkthrough of the tunnels, the machines, even a short ride inside one of the test loops. "You're a guest of honor," the coordinator said. Frank wasn't sure he needed the honor. He was just excited to see the machines. To walk through something he'd only ever dreamed of. He called Emily. Told her the news. She was stunned. Then proud. "Can I come with you?" she asked. Frank felt his throat tighten. "I'd love that." They hadn't traveled together since Helen's funeral. At the airport, she wheeled his bag even though he insisted he could do it. On the plane, she held his hand during takeoff. "Don't look so surprised," she whispered. "You're kind of famous now." The sight was like stepping into the future. Miles of tunnels under the desert floor, the scent of ozone and ambition in the air. Engineers in orange vests, screens full of data, the whirring sound of drills and motors echoing through polished concrete corridors. Frank watched in awe as a pod zipped silently by, sleek and silver. The engineer beside him smiled. "Looks a bit like your model, doesn't it?" Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah. It really does." He reached into his backpack and pulled out the old cardboard loop, the one he'd built as a child. He held it next to the real tunnel, the past and the present side by side. "I used to think this was a fantasy," he said. "Turns out it was just early." They gave him a commemorative plaque. Took photos. Asked for his feedback. But the moment that hit him hardest came when one of the lead engineers, a woman maybe in her 40s, bright eyes and calloused hands, approached him and said, "We talk about you here. You're why we push harder. Because if a guy in Pennsylvania can build a working prototype in his garage, we've got no excuse." Frank laughed. "I didn't mean to set the bar." "But you did," she said. "Thank you." On the flight home, Emily leaned her head on his shoulder. "Mom would be proud," she whispered. "You made something that matters." He looked out the window, the clouds below like soft tunnels of their own. "Yeah," he said. "I think she'd get a kick out of it." Back home, the garage was still there. Dustier than before. The model a little more worn. But something had shifted. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about connection. Purpose. Continuation. The tunnel hadn't just changed Frank's life. It had reconnected him to it. He kept building. Kept writing. Kept walking past the middle school and its banner that still read, "Imagine. Inspire. Innovate." Sometimes he'd stop and touch the fence, just to feel its cool metal under his fingertips, like holding the present in one hand and the future in the other. The breakthrough wasn't a single moment. It was 1,000 small decisions stacked together. To move. To try. To believe. And now, he knew, you didn't need permission to dream again. You just needed to start. And starting, no matter how late, was the most powerful thing you could do. Frank Delaney never imagined that his legacy would come from PVC pipe, old train parts, and a garage that still smelled faintly of motor oil and pine cleaner, but as summer drifted into fall, he realized it wasn't the materials that mattered, it was what he'd built with them, and more importantly, what they had awakened in others. Every day brought a new message now. From retired machinists in Ohio who dusted off their welding gear. From a grandmother in Iowa who started a robotics club with her grandkids after reading his blog. From teenagers in Indonesia who translated his tunnel concept into a classroom project. Frank read them all, sometimes twice, and printed the ones that hit the deepest. He'd tacked them on a bulletin board near his workbench, next to that original Musk tweet and Jasmine's letter with the little heart-shaped pods. He called it the legacy wall, though he'd never say that out loud. He wasn't doing this for glory. He was doing it because he finally understood that legacy isn't something you leave behind, it's something you live into, piece by piece, while you're still breathing. Emily visited more often now. Sometimes she brought her kids, who loved the garage almost as much as he did. They ran around the model city he'd built on plywood, making whooshing sounds as they pushed the tiny pods through the tunnels, pretending to be engineers and explorers. One afternoon, her youngest, Max, asked, "Grandpa, when do I get to build something?" And Frank knelt down and said, "You already are. Every time you imagine something new, you're building the future." Max beamed like Frank had handed him a star. That evening, Frank sat Emily down and opened the manila folder he'd been keeping in the kitchen drawer for months. Inside were pages of notes, diagrams, passwords, email accounts, and instructions for what to do if. He pushed it toward her. "I want you to have this," he said. She looked up, concerned. "Dad, I'm not going anywhere," he said gently. "But this project, it's bigger than me now. If I drop tomorrow, someone needs to know how to keep it going." She opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the meticulous handwriting. "You really think this could keep going?" I know it can, he said. People believe in it. More importantly, they believe in what it represents. It's not about tunnels, M. It's about rediscovering motion when the world says you're done. She sat back, holding the folder against her chest like it was sacred. I'll keep it safe, she said. But you're not going anywhere. He smiled. Well, not yet. Word continued to spread. An educational nonprofit reached out, asking if Frank would consider licensing his designs as part of a STEM curriculum for older adults. We're seeing a new wave of lifelong learners, the director said. You're proof that innovation doesn't retire. Frank agreed, on one condition, that it stay accessible, affordable, and open source. This isn't just mine, he said. It belongs to anyone who's ever felt like their best ideas were behind them. They called it the Frank Loop Initiative. Catchy, he thought. Mason helped him shoot a welcome video, nothing fancy, just Frank in the garage, surrounded by models and tools and that original cardboard tunnel. Welcome to the loop, he said into the camera, smiling. We start with what we've got. We move forward, one idea at a time. The video racked up hundreds of thousands of views. Comments poured in. A man in his 60s wrote, I've been in rehab for 2 years after a stroke. Today, I printed my first tunnel piece on a 3D printer because of you. A woman in her 70s said, my husband passed last year. I haven't felt purpose since. This project gave me something to build again. Thank you. Frank read them all, often with a hand to his chest, that old ache of grief and joy mingling like it always did when something real was happening. He didn't stop walking. Didn't stop building. Didn't stop thinking. If anything, his mind was sharper now, more alive than it had been in decades. Each evening, he returned to the shed, adjusted the models, logged his notes, answered emails. But there were changes, too. Subtle ones. His hands trembled more now. His knees stiffened faster after long days on his feet. His hearing wasn't what it used to be. One night, he dropped a tool and had to sit down for 20 minutes before he could stand again. He didn't complain. He just made adjustments. Slower days. More rest. He brought in a stool so he could sit while wiring. Installed a space heater to ease the joint pain in winter. Legacy, he realized, wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. The model city grew. He added a school, a power station, a hospital, all connected by miniature pods. He made little figurines with the kids, placing them at the stations. That one's you, Max said, pointing to a tiny figure near the tunnel hub. He looks like a boss. Frank laughed. He's just figuring it out. One crisp October morning, he stood at the middle school fence again. The paint on the banner was starting to peel. He brought a brush and touched it up, humming softly as he worked. A man passing by on a bike slowed down. You're the tunnel guy, right? Frank nodded. I guess I am. Thanks for not giving up, the man said. My dad started tinkering again because of you. Says he hasn't felt this alive in years. Frank dipped the brush in paint and smiled. That makes 2 of us. That afternoon, he started writing a book. Mason helped with formatting. Emily with editing. The title came easily, Tunnels and Time, How I Found the Future in My Garage. He didn't care if it sold. He just wanted the story to exist, for someone like him, decades from now, to stumble on it and feel that same electric jolt of, maybe it's not too late. He wrote every morning. A little at a time. In the evenings, he built. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk out back, sit in a lawn chair, and stare at the stars. He often thought of Helen then. Of how she used to believe in his crazy ideas before they were anything at all. You've always had an inventor's heart, she once said. Just needed the right spark. He hoped she could see him now. Not because of the attention or the emails or the models. But because of the man he'd become. The one who stopped waiting to be remembered and chose instead to make something worth remembering. Winter came. Snow dusted the roof of the shed. The garage was cold but alive. Mason brought a small space heater and a thermos of soup. They worked quietly, like old friends, comfortable in the rhythm of progress. "You ever think we'd come this far?" Mason asked one night. Frank looked around. "I hoped. But no. I never thought the loop would be the thing." Mason leaned against the wall. "Maybe it wasn't about the tunnel. Maybe it was about reconnecting the parts of yourself that got lost." Frank nodded. "That's the real underground system." As the year ended, Frank received an invitation to speak at an innovation summit in Chicago. "We'd love to hear from someone proving age isn't the end of invention." Emily insisted on going with him. The kids made signs, "Go Grandpa Frank." The speech was short, from a stool, with his notes shaking just slightly in his hands. But his voice was steady. "I thought I was building something small," he said. "But it turns out, I was digging my way out. Out of regret. Out of stillness. Out of the idea that the best parts of me were already spent. Turns out, they weren't. They were just waiting for a reason." The crowd rose to their feet. Not because he was eloquent, but because he was real. A man who hadn't given up. Who had built something from dust and memory and made it matter. That night, back in the hotel room, Emily hugged him long and hard. "You've changed so many people, Dad," she said. "But I think the biggest change is you." He nodded. "Yeah. I think I finally figured out how to live." In the morning, he walked outside into the cold air, looked up at the skyline, and smiled. The tunnel had done its job. Not by taking him somewhere else, but by bringing him fully back to himself. Frank Delaney woke to the hum of ideas instead of the creak of joints. The morning light filtered through the dusty window of his garage-turned lab, casting long shadows over his latest creation, a modular tunnel segment equipped with sensors and LED lighting. He'd stayed up late tweaking the wiring, testing the microprocessor responses. As he blinked away sleep, he realized he no longer feared the early hour. Instead, he felt eager, an unfamiliar warmth bubbling in his chest. He had a blueprint now, one he couldn't see on paper, but felt in moments like this. After a mug of strong coffee, he opened his laptop and reread the blog comments lining his latest post. One message stood out: "Your tunnel makes me feel seen again." It arrived from a woman named Evelyn, age 74, who said she'd felt invisible after her husband died. She wrote that she printed a model piece and placed it next to her late husband's toolbox, and, for the first time in a year, that box looked like possibility, not just memory. His eyes stung. He realized his project had become more than his own second act. It was a lifeline for others. He read it again: possibility, not just memory. He closed the browser and looked up. The tunnel segment glowed quietly on the bench, a silent promise. As autumn leaves drifted past the window, he remembered the gray afternoons when the house felt empty. He'd walked past that garage door 1,000 times without purpose. But now it was a portal, an entrance to possibility, for him, for Evelyn, for everyone watching. He walked outside and paused by the middle school's banner that still said, "Imagine. Inspire. Innovate." The letters were worn but true, like a scar on a beloved face. He touched the peeling paint. Wore the day's chill like a reminder: blueprints live in hands, not files. Back in the garage, he sketched a new idea: an educational kit with small snap-together tunnel pieces, simple enough for a senior to assemble and program at home. He imagined elderly learners, lonely but curious, building networks of mini tunnels with sensors that lit up when connected. They could host workshops at community centers or assisted living homes. He thought of Evelyn and wrote her, "Your memory matters, you matter. Would you like to test a kit?" He hit send. The rest of the day vanished. He gathered materials. Clear tubing, magnets, LEDs, small breadboards. Mason arrived after school, flashlight in hand, ready to work. "What's the plan today?" Mason asked. Frank showed him the sketch and said, "I want to build something people can touch and expand." They talked through logistics, size, power. Mason pulled up online parts catalogs. Frank made notes in his weathered notebook. The penalty for failure had changed. Now it was responsibility, not just for himself, but for others who believed. Evelyn's message weighed heavy but steady in his mind. They prototyped a 12-inch segment. A touch sensor triggered a color shift, red to green, like a heartbeat. Frank soldered connections, Mason helped with code. By late afternoon, the segment glowed softly on the bench. It hummed with intention. They tested it. It worked. Frank let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He lifted it, reverently, like holding a newborn star. That night he wrote a blog post, "The Unseen Blueprint. How we build more than tunnels." He described the kit, the purpose, the idea that even unseen frameworks, networks of care, connection, hope, can hold weight. Comments came quickly, teachers asking how to bring it into classrooms, caregivers asking how to use it in memory therapy groups, seniors thanking him for seeing them again. He realized the unseen blueprint mattered more than steel or plastic. It was about wiring hearts. A week later, Evelyn replied, "I received the kit yesterday. I don't understand code, but I hammered the pieces together anyway. When it lit up, I cried. I felt seen." Frank pressed his hand to his chest. He'd known there was value, but this was deeper. More urgent. He forwarded the message to Mason and Emily. They sat around the kitchen table reading it, silent. Emily reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's why you did it, Dad." He nodded. Emily's voice cracked, "Not just for you." He hadn't realized until that moment how big the ripple had become. Later, as dusk settled, he took a walk. The blueprints in his head grew more complex: community networks, intergenerational workshops, accessible guides, open-source design catalogs. He smelled wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. He realized he wasn't the only one building. Everyone who saw that light in Evelyn's tunnel would build too. That was the unseen blueprint, seed ideas spread through quiet generosity. The next morning, a local public library contacted him. They wanted to host a workshop series. They offered tables, tools, space, and invited him to lead seniors through building kits. He agreed. Over the next few weeks, the library's conference room filled with retirees in sweaters and scarves. Frank arrived early, lugging kits and tools and extra wires. At first, the room was nervous, men and women who hadn't used tools in years, who thought they were done. He welcomed them. Showed them the pieces. "This kit is more than plastic. It's more than code. It's a reminder that we matter." They watched him connect sensors and light. He passed out kits. Hands that trembled at first began snapping pieces together. Fingers that shook found steadiness soldering LED wires. They laughed at the unexpected success. They nodded when one of the sensors glowed. One woman, Marjorie, age 79, said, voice wavering, "I haven't built anything since my kids were little." Her eyes were damp. Frank asked her to say what she felt after it lit. She said, "Alive." The word echoed in the quiet room. Later, participants stayed long after the session ended, trading ideas, elder care spaces, sensory therapy pieces, memory aids. It became clear, Frank's unseen blueprint was turning into real-life community action. He looked out the window at the group deep in collaboration and thought, this is legacy. Not monuments or plaques, but networks of people, lit with possibility. Mason filmed the final moments to post on the blog. Emily helped moderate the comments that poured in that night. You changed the narrative about aging, one commenter wrote. You gave us the blueprint. Frank exhaled. He stood at the door of the room and said quietly, to no one in particular, we're not done. Back home, the legacy wall in the garage grew, notes, photos, sketches, workshop summaries, thank you cards. Evelyn's handwritten note sat framed next to Jasmine's drawing and that original Musk tweet. It glowed, unassuming, but luminous. He closed the garage door for the night, walked down the driveway, and turned to look back. The shed and bench were dark now, but he could still feel the current beneath, pulsing. A network of light unseen, but charged and humming. He walked inside and found Emily at the kitchen table, Mason beside her, both smiling. How was it? She asked. He's Saturday, quiet, he said. Simple. Real. And exactly what it should be. Emily leaned over and kissed his forehead. You're building more than tunnels, Dad. He nodded. The blueprint was always unseen, he said. But now everyone can see it. The day of the gathering arrived with a golden autumn light spilling through the garage windows, illuminating tools, sketches, and that glowing tunnel model like a stationary sunrise. Frank Delaney, with a nervous breath he hadn't felt since he started this whole journey, unlocked the garage door early and surveyed the space. It had transformed from a cluttered relic of retirement into a humming engine of creativity. Beneath the flicker of bare bulbs, desks and tables were arranged in a curve around the central working bench, draped with a banner that read, Tunnel Together Workshop. Mason arrived with extra chairs and cables draped over his shoulder. He kissed Frank's cheek. Ready? Frank nodded. As I'll ever be. One by one, folks arrived, engineering students with sharp questions, retired machinists with calloused hands, curious neighbors, several local kids, and the woman from the library, Marjorie, who beamed like a living testimony. Emily rolled in with Max and his cousin Rose. The kids wore shirts that said, Tunnel Builder, and carried sketch pads filled with illustrations of tube cities and pod systems. Frank clapped his hands, more to steady himself than anything, and said, Welcome. Today, we're building something more than tunnels. We're building connection. The group leaned in. He handed out kits, explained sensor basics, power connections, code logic. Mason assisted quietly, passing soldering irons and offering tips. The chatter began. Some trembled at wiring LEDs. Others laughed remembering their past DIY failures. But when the first pod lit up and glowed green, the room erupted. Applause and laughter mixed like music. Frank watched the faces, the young student whose eyes blazed with inspiration, the retired mechanic whose knuckles flexed around a wire like a new promise, the kids who squealed, Look, Grandpa, it's alive. Emily caught his gaze and smiled, Max's little fist bumped Frank's leg. The moment wasn't cinematic. It was living water. Every kit became a story. A retired teacher said she'd used the model to explain electricity in after-school classes. A woman whose hands shook with Parkinson's surprised her therapist when she snapped pieces together with strength she didn't know she still had. Frank felt tears burn behind his eyes, framed photos, old memories, loss, hope, all blended like paint. The work continued all afternoon. Mason led a concurrent coding corner, where young programmers helped seniors tweak the sensor's color thresholds. One older man, Bill, kept adjusting wires, cursing and smiling, until finally the lights dimmed and he whispered, I haven't done this in 40 years. Frank came over and rested a hand on his shoulder. Bill's voice trembled, thank you for the permission. Later, when the room quieted, Frank stood before the group and said, voice steady but tender, I thought this was about tunnels. But it isn't. It's about people rediscovering themselves, and each other. Anything we build today is meaningful if it brings us closer to what matters. The group exchanged looks, nodded like leaves caught in a warm gust of wind. Mason began cleaning up. Emily and the kids packed tools. Marjorie whispered, aren't you exhausted? Frank shook his head. I feel more alive than ever. That evening, emails arrived, photos of identical gatherings from Pittsburgh to Portland at community centers using his open-source plans, people tagging #TunnelTogether. Messages like, I built with my grandkids, and, I'm teaching again because you reminded me how. Frank's thumb hovered over the reply button. He paused, smiled, typed, I'm building too, and I'll send the plans your way. He leaned back. The sky outside the garage was deep twilight blue. He closed the door gently. Inside, the legacy wall bulged with new names, photos, handwritten notes. A blueprint humming with quiet electricity across towns, ages, hearts. Frank walked inside, found Emily seated at the kitchen table, counting memory. What do you think? He asked. I think we just built a movement, she replied, wiping tears. He shook his head. Not I. We. And he knew she was right. The gathering was no endpoint, it was an ignition. A single spark, fanned by hands of all ages, lighting a visible path, through tubes and hearts and years, that began beneath the surface, where belief once lay dormant, waiting for connection to wake it up all over again. Frank sat nervously in the studio waiting room, the bright lights outside the soundproof glass shining like stars he could almost reach. The interviewer's questions swirled in his mind. What made you start this project at your age? How did Elon Musk inspire you? Do you think it's really possible to reinvent yourself after 60? He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every expectation and hope pressed into this moment. When the producer called his name, Frank stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the stage. The set was warm and inviting, yet intimidating, an expanse of polished wood floors and soft chairs, cameras swiveling like mechanical eyes. The host, a well-known journalist named Lisa Carver, smiled and shook his hand firmly. Frank, it's so great to have you here. Your story has touched so many. He nodded, thankful but wary. As the lights dimmed and cameras rolled, Lisa asked the first question, Frank, many people say it's too late to chase new dreams after retirement. What made you decide otherwise? Frank paused and thought of the quiet evenings in his garage, the blueprints, the emails from strangers who felt invisible. I realized the too late is just a story we tell ourselves. Elon Musk's words stuck with me, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. I thought, maybe it's not about how old I am, but how much I care. Lisa nodded, leaning forward. That's powerful. Tell us about the tunnel project. How did it grow from a hobby to a movement? He explained the garage transformation, the blog, the kits, and the community workshops. The cameras captured his hands as they mimicked building, lighting up invisible pathways in the air. It became more than tunnels. It became a way to connect, to give people permission to create and be seen again. Lisa smiled. You mentioned Elon Musk earlier. What about him inspired you the most? Frank thought of the fearless innovation, the refusal to accept limits, the constant pushing beyond. Elon's mindset is a rebellion against the status quo. He's not afraid to fail, and he reminds us that age, doubt, and fear don't have to stop us. That's the spark I needed. The interview moved on to harder questions, the skepticism from his children, the medical warnings, the loneliness of starting anew. Frank didn't hide the struggles, sharing the honest moments of doubt and pain. Lisa responded with empathy, making the audience feel the emotional arc. What do you say to others who feel left behind or too old to change? Frank looked straight at the camera. It's never too late to matter. Sometimes you just need someone or something to give you permission. I hope this story, this project, can be that for someone. After the interview, as the lights went dark and the crew packed up, Frank felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. On the way home, Emily and Mason waited with open arms. They listened as Frank recounted every detail, the nerves, the surprise applause. You were incredible, Emily said. Mason nodded. You gave them hope. That night, messages flooded in from viewers, older adults inspired, caregivers moved, skeptics curious. Frank replied to many, feeling the ripple grow stronger. Days later, a producer called to offer a longer feature story, a chance to reach millions more. Frank hesitated, then said yes. He was no longer just building tunnels, he was building a new legacy, one that didn't end with age, but began there, fueled by courage, connection, and a refusal to fade quietly away. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Delaney's phone buzzed in the quiet kitchen, its sharp ring cutting through the soft hum of evening. It was the doctor's office. He hesitated before answering, the echo of his last checkup still fresh, the words, high blood pressure, and, slow down, hanging heavy like a storm cloud. Frank, your latest tests show some concerning changes, the nurse said gently. Your heart needs rest. Please take it easy. He hung up, heart pounding, but not just from the news. This was the setback, the cold splash of reality that reminded him age wasn't just a number, it was a limit. For a moment, all the energy he'd built around the tunnel project, the workshops, the blog, the interviews, seemed to drain away like water from a cracked bucket. He felt the familiar weight of exhaustion, the silent voice whispering, maybe this is it. Maybe you pushed too hard. That night, Frank sat in his dimly lit garage, tools and tunnel parts scattered around like unfinished dreams. The glowing LEDs on the prototype pulsed softly, as if sensing his doubt. He stared at them, willing them to ignite a spark inside himself. But the fatigue lingered. The next days were a battle, between rest and the urge to keep building, between caution and the hunger to connect, to create, to prove he was still alive. Emily noticed the change. Dad, you don't have to do everything, she said softly, watching him rub his chest after climbing the stairs. Mason offered to help more with coding and workshops, sensing the strain. But Frank's mind raced with questions. Was this project a foolish rebellion? Was he endangering himself for a cause that might never matter? Then he remembered Elon Musk's interview from years ago, where Elon said, persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Not because he was reckless, but because giving up wasn't an option. One afternoon, after a slow walk around the block, Frank sat on a park bench watching children play. He thought about setbacks, like the seasons, inevitable but temporary. He realized his project didn't need him to be perfect. It needed him to be honest, to adapt, to keep moving forward in whatever way he could. He began sharing his struggle on the blog, admitting his fears and limits. The response was immediate and powerful. Followers sent messages of encouragement, sharing their own battles with health, age, and change. They reminded him, and themselves, that setbacks are part of every journey. One message from Evelyn read, I had a fall last week. It scared me. But your tunnel kits remind me to keep building, piece by piece. This gave Frank strength. He scaled back the physical parts of his work, delegating more to Mason and Emily but stayed the project's heart and voice. He organized virtual workshops, recorded tutorials, and wrote heartfelt reflections. The community grew not despite the setback, but because of it. Frank's vulnerability became a beacon. He learned to accept help without shame and to celebrate small victories. Months later, a local news crew visited to film a segment on the movement's resilience. Frank spoke openly about his health, the fears, and the determination to continue. This project isn't just about building tunnels, he said, voice steady. It's about building hope, even when the path isn't easy. That evening, as the camera crews packed up, Emily hugged her father tightly. You're still inspiring, she whispered. Frank smiled, feeling the truth in her words. He wasn't just fighting age. He was transforming it, turning limits into new kinds of freedom. The setback was real, but it wasn't the end. It was part of the blueprint, the unseen wiring that made the light inside burn brighter. He closed the garage door gently, the prototype glowing softly in the dark. The tunnel was far from finished, just like his story. And that was okay. Because sometimes, the deepest breakthroughs come after the hardest falls. Frank woke early that morning with a clarity that had eluded him in recent weeks. The setback had been a brutal reminder of his limits, but it also rekindled a quiet fire, a sense that while his body required care, his mind and spirit demanded action. He knew he had to return to the core of why he started, not to prove something to others, but to reclaim his own life. After a breakfast of black coffee and toast, Frank stepped into the garage and surveyed the scattered tools and half-finished tunnel segments. For a moment, the clutter overwhelmed him, but then he breathed in the scent of wood, metal, and possibility, a familiar comfort. Mason arrived soon after, carrying a box of new components. "Ready to pick up where we left off?" Mason asked, eyes bright with energy. Frank smiled, "Let's build." Together, they refined the educational kits, simplifying assembly instructions and adding clearer diagrams. They designed a new module that would integrate simple voice commands, enabling users with limited mobility to control the tunnel lights through speech. Emily joined the effort remotely, designing accessible online tutorials and managing community feedback. The project was evolving, shaped by challenges and the deepening connection among the team. Frank felt a profound gratitude. He realized this wasn't just his story, it was theirs. One afternoon, a surprise visit arrived. Evelyn came to the garage, walking with a cane but radiating determination. "I thought I'd come see the magic in person," she said, smiling. Frank welcomed her warmly, showing her the new voice-activated module. Evelyn tried it out, her eyes lighting up as the LEDs responded to her words. "It's like the tunnel speaking back to me," she said softly. Their conversation drifted to life's hardships, the loneliness, the fears, but also the unexpected joys born from connection. Frank shared his own doubts, and Evelyn nodded knowingly, "We're not alone in this." Word of the visit spread through the community, inspiring others to engage more deeply. Frank organized a "Return to Build" event at the local community center, inviting people to bring old projects, ideas, and stories. The room filled with laughter, shared memories, and the clatter of tools. It was a celebration of resilience and reinvention. During the event, a young volunteer named Hannah approached Frank, nervous but hopeful. She explained she cared for her aging grandmother, who had lost much of her confidence. Hannah wondered if the kits could help rekindle her grandmother's sense of purpose. Frank's eyes sparkled. "That's exactly what we're building for." Together, they crafted a plan to deliver kits and host remote workshops. The sense of purpose swelled within Frank as the community network grew, weaving a tapestry of support, learning, and joy. One evening, Frank sat alone in the garage, the soft hum of LEDs illuminating the space. He reflected on the journey, the setbacks, the breakthroughs, the unexpected friendships. The tunnel was no longer just a physical object but a symbol of connection, hope, and the power to reinvent. He typed a final blog post for the night, sharing his gratitude and urging others to embrace their own returns, no matter the obstacles. The next morning, Frank received an email from a national nonprofit interested in partnering to bring the kits to underserved senior communities across the country. The opportunity felt overwhelming but right. With the team's support, Frank accepted, ready to expand the movement beyond his small town. As the seasons shifted, Frank's health stabilized. He walked daily, guided by doctors but driven by his purpose. He found balance between rest and creation. One evening, Emily found him sketching new designs, a peaceful smile on his face. "Looks like you're still dreaming," she teased. Frank laughed softly. "Dreams don't retire." The tunnel beneath the garage now glowed softly as a symbol of persistence and renewal. Frank knew the journey was far from over, but he also knew he was no longer alone. The return was a beginning, not an end. And in that, he found peace. Frank sat in the community center auditorium, surrounded by an eager but skeptical crowd. The non-profit partnership had brought new resources and attention, but with it came challenges, doubts, questions, and the weight of expectations. As he looked around, he saw faces lined with years of hard work and quiet despair, people who had been told no too many times. Frank understood because he had been there himself. He took a deep breath and stepped to the podium. Thank you all for coming. I know many of you have faced barriers. Whether it's age, health, or feeling overlooked. This project isn't about erasing those struggles. It's about facing them together. He shared stories from the workshops, how a retired machinist found new purpose wiring LEDs, how a grandmother and granddaughter reconnected through building pods, how even the smallest spark can ignite something bigger than us. A hand went up in the crowd. But what if it's too late? What if the system is stacked against us? The question hung in the air, sharp and raw. Frank didn't flinch. It's never too late. Elon Musk reminded me that the impossible is just the untried. We might face limits, but limits can be pushed or even redefined. It's not about ignoring reality, but refusing to be defined by it. Another voice called out, but what about the technology? Isn't this just for the young or the tech-savvy? Frank smiled. That's why we've adapted the kits for all abilities, made tutorials accessible, and created community support. We build not just tunnels, but bridges between generations and skills. As the session progressed, Frank noticed a shift, eyes brightening, nods, tentative smiles. The challenge was met with courage, and courage bred hope. That evening, Frank sat with Emily and Mason, discussing next steps. Mason was excited about integrating augmented reality, while Emily pushed for more storytelling to amplify personal journeys. Frank felt a surge of energy, knowing the challenge was a chance to grow. Yet, the stress weighed on him. His health reminded him daily of its fragility. One afternoon, a critical email arrived. A major donor was pulling support, citing doubts about scalability. The news hit like a thunderclap. Frank wrestled with despair but refused to give up. Drawing on Elon's philosophy, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor, he crafted a heartfelt letter to the donor, inviting them to witness the impact firsthand. Weeks later, a small delegation visited the workshop, watching seniors and youth collaborate, witnessing transformation. The donor's expression softened, and support resumed, albeit cautiously. Frank realized the path would be uneven, marked by victories and setbacks. But every challenge was a testament to resilience. He penned a new blog post titled, "The Challenge is the Change," sharing his belief that obstacles are the raw material of growth. The community responded with stories of their own battles, building a tapestry of shared strength. One night, alone in the garage, Frank stared at the glowing tunnel prototype. He thought about how the underground tubes, twisting and turning, reflected the journey he and so many others had taken, dark moments giving way to light, uncertainty leading to discovery. He whispered, "This is just the beginning." The next morning, a local newspaper ran a feature on Frank's movement, dubbing it, "The Tunnel That Connects Generations." The story spread quickly, inspiring new groups to start their own projects. Frank received messages from across the country, letters, videos, invitations. The challenge had become a catalyst. And while the road ahead remained steep, Frank felt ready, bolstered by the power of community, innovation, and unwavering hope. In the quiet moments before sleep, he held on to one truth: age is not the end of possibility, but the start of a new kind of adventure. The breakthrough came on a crisp spring morning when Frank least expected it. He had spent countless hours tweaking the tunnel model, refining the kits, and responding to emails, but progress sometimes felt like a slow crawl uphill. That day, Mason burst into the garage, eyes wide with excitement, holding a small circuit board. "Frank, you've got to see this." Frank wiped his hands on his jeans and followed Mason to the workbench. Mason explained they had finally solved a key problem with the sensor integration. Now the pods could automatically adjust lighting and sound based on the user's mood, detected through subtle changes in voice and touch. It was a leap forward, turning the tunnel from a static model into an interactive experience. Frank's heart surged. This breakthrough meant the project could truly connect in ways they had only dreamed about, reaching seniors who felt isolated, giving them a new sense of engagement and agency. The next weeks flew by in a blur of testing, demonstration, and celebration. The community workshops evolved into immersive experiences where participants shared stories while the pods responded with light patterns and soft melodies, creating a shared emotional space. Frank watched as a woman named Linda, who had been withdrawn and silent, smiled and laughed for the first time in months as the tunnel reacted to her laughter with gentle twinkles. Emily documented these moments, her camera capturing raw emotion and transformation. The breakthrough caught the attention of a tech magazine, which ran a feature titled "The Tunnel That Listens," spotlighting how innovation could serve humanity's deepest needs, not just efficiency or profit. Invitations poured in, conferences, podcasts, community forums, offering platforms to share their vision. Frank spoke with quiet passion, always returning to the core message: age is not a limitation but a reservoir of untapped potential. When we listen to each other, we create bridges across generations and experience. Yet even amid the excitement, Frank remained grounded. He remembered the setbacks, the health warnings, the skeptical voices. This breakthrough was not a finish line but a milestone on a longer journey. One afternoon, after a particularly moving workshop where a group of veterans shared stories of loss and resilience, Frank felt a deep sense of purpose. He realized the tunnel was more than technology or connection, it was a symbol of hope and rebirth. He wrote a reflective post on the blog titled "The Breakthrough is Belief," exploring how faith in oneself and others could unlock doors long thought closed. Responses poured in from around the world, letters from caregivers, stories from isolated seniors, messages of thanks from people reclaiming their lives. One message, from a man named George who had recently lost his wife, touched Frank deeply. George wrote that the tunnel had helped him find light in grief, a way to remember love without being consumed by loss. Frank printed the message and pinned it to the legacy wall, a growing collage of moments, memories, and milestones. The breakthrough ignited a new phase of energy and possibility. Frank, Mason, and Emily brainstormed plans to expand access, partnering with assisted living centers and libraries. They developed training programs for volunteers, ensuring the kits could reach those most in need. The movement grew organically, rooted in authenticity and shared humanity. Yet, late at night, Frank often sat quietly, contemplating the fragility of life and the fleeting nature of time. He knew the journey would continue to challenge him, test his resolve, and demand adaptability. But with every breakthrough, no matter how small, he felt the power of transformation ripple outward. Through tunnels, through stories, through hearts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Frank stood outside the garage, watching the soft glow from inside. He whispered to the fading light, "This is just the beginning." And deep within him, he believed it truly was. Despite the breakthrough, doubt crept into Frank's mind like a slow fog settling over a once clear landscape. The glowing tunnel in his garage, the supportive community, the growing recognition, they all felt fragile under the weight of uncertainty. One morning, after reading a critical comment on the blog suggesting the project was a vanity hobby, Frank sat in his worn armchair, staring out at the gray skies. The words stung, echoing old fears. Had he been foolish to believe change was possible at his age? The voice inside whispered, "Maybe it's too late. Maybe you're just chasing shadows." Emily noticed the shift in his mood and approached gently. "Dad, what's wrong?" Frank forced a smile. "Just the usual doubts." She sat beside him, reminding him of how far he'd come, how many lives had been touched. "Remember when you told me Elon Musk said, persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." Her words were a balm, but the doubt lingered. That day, Frank struggled through the workshops, his enthusiasm dampened. Questions from participants about sustainability, funding, and long-term impact felt like critiques of his very self. Late at night, he wrestled with the fear of failure. Was he chasing a dream that would vanish like smoke? He confided in Mason, who reminded him that doubt was part of every great journey. Even Elon Musk faced skepticism, setbacks, and moments of despair. What matters is how we respond. Frank took that to heart but couldn't shake the feeling of being an imposter among innovators and dreamers. He began to withdraw, skipping meetings, delaying blog posts. The community noticed and reached out with messages of support, reminding him that he was not alone. One message from Evelyn read, "Your courage to start gave me hope to keep going. Please don't give up on us." That night, Frank reflected on the power of connection, realizing that the project had become more than just his vision, it was a shared dream fueled by collective hope. Slowly, he began to re-engage, starting with small actions, responding to comments, sharing candid reflections on his struggles. Transparency became a bridge rather than a barrier. The doubt remained but no longer ruled. Frank learned to sit with uncertainty, letting it fuel curiosity instead of fear. He revisited Elon Musk's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words became a mantra, a lifeline. The community grew stronger as vulnerability deepened. Workshops became spaces not just for building tunnels but for sharing fears, dreams, and resilience. Frank discovered that doubt was not the enemy but a companion on the path to transformation. As spring turned to summer, Frank organized a retreat, inviting members of the community to gather in person, to reconnect and recharge. Around a campfire, stories flowed, of loss, hope, reinvention. Frank shared his own journey with honesty, embracing doubt as a catalyst for growth. The retreat sparked renewed energy and commitment. Frank returned home with a clear vision, to embrace imperfection, to welcome challenges as teachers, and to lead with authenticity. In a new blog post titled, "Doubt is the Doorway," he invited others to share their own struggles and to see doubt not as a stop sign but a gateway to deeper courage. The response was overwhelming. Letters and messages poured in, echoing Frank's experience. One woman wrote, "I thought I was too old to learn new things, but your story helped me take the first step." Another said, "Doubt kept me stuck for years. Now I see it as a sign I'm on the edge of something new." Through doubt, Frank and his community discovered a profound truth, that courage isn't the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward in spite of it. Standing once more in his glowing garage, Frank felt the weight of doubt balanced by the light of hope. The tunnel was no longer just a project but a testament to resilience, connection, and the endless possibility of new beginnings. He whispered to himself, "This journey isn't about perfection. It's about persistence." And with that, he stepped boldly into the next chapter. Frank had never truly understood the power of connection until it was all he had left. The tunnel project had become more than a technical challenge or a personal mission, it had transformed into a lifeline, binding strangers and old friends alike through shared stories and mutual support. One rainy afternoon, as the droplets tapped rhythmically against the garage roof, Frank received a call from a woman named Grace. She introduced herself as a retired schoolteacher from a town several states away who had discovered the blog during a restless night searching for meaning. Her voice was warm but tinged with the weariness of years spent feeling invisible and forgotten. Grace shared how the tunnel kits had rekindled a spark in her life, how assembling the parts had given her purpose and a way to reconnect with her grandchildren who visited rarely but stayed longer when they could build something together. Frank listened intently, feeling a surge of humility and gratitude. This was the connection he had been searching for, proof that his work was more than a project, it was a thread weaving through lives. That evening, he wrote a new blog post titled, "The Heart of the Tunnel." Connection, reflecting on how the simple act of building together bridged not just physical spaces but emotional distances. The post invited readers to share their own stories, and responses flooded in, testaments of healing, friendship, and rediscovery. Emily suggested hosting virtual meetups, where participants from across the country could come together to share experiences, ask questions, and celebrate small victories. The first gathering was tentative, with a handful of faces on the screen, but as stories unfolded, laughter and tears blended into a tapestry of shared humanity. Frank marveled at the way technology could dissolve barriers, turning isolation into community. One participant, a man named Carl, shared how the tunnel project had helped him cope with the loss of his wife, giving him something to focus on and a reason to get out of bed each morning. Another, Rosa, spoke of how assembling the kits had reconnected her with her teenage granddaughter, bridging the generational gap that had once seemed insurmountable. These connections deepened Frank's resolve to expand the project's reach. He reached out to libraries, senior centers, and faith-based organizations, offering workshops and resources tailored to diverse communities. The response was overwhelming, with volunteers stepping forward to lead local efforts. The movement was no longer just his, it was a living, breathing network of care and creativity. Yet, amidst the growth, Frank remained mindful of the need for balance. He continued to listen to his body, pacing himself and prioritizing rest. Emily often reminded him, "You can't pour from an empty cup." Frank smiled, recognizing that self-care was a vital part of sustaining the mission. One afternoon, as he prepared for a workshop at a nearby community center, Frank noticed a familiar figure waiting outside, Evelyn. She had become a close friend and pillar of support, her own journey mirroring the resilience at the heart of the project. Together, they welcomed participants, sharing stories and encouraging collaboration. The room buzzed with energy and hope. Afterward, Frank and Evelyn sat quietly, reflecting on how far they had come. "This connection," Evelyn said softly, "it's what keeps me going." Frank nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest like a steady flame. In his quiet moments, Frank often thought about Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of bold ideas, his willingness to challenge norms and redefine possibilities. But Frank realized that while Elon's example had sparked the journey, it was the human connections, the shared struggles, the laughter, the support that fueled the fire. The tunnel was not just a physical structure but a metaphor for the invisible pathways that connect hearts across time and space. As summer deepened, Frank organized a special event called the Connection Festival, bringing together community members, volunteers, families, and newcomers for a day of celebration, workshops, and storytelling. The event took place in the town park, transformed with colorful tents, twinkling lights, and the joyful noise of laughter and music. Frank watched as seniors and children worked side by side, building tunnels and sharing stories. The air was thick with possibility and renewal. Standing before the crowd that evening, Frank spoke with quiet conviction. "We are not alone. Age does not define us, our connections do. Through these tunnels, we are building more than pathways in wood and wire, we are building bridges between hearts and generations." The applause was warm and heartfelt. Later, as the festival wound down and stars emerged overhead, Frank felt a profound sense of peace. The doubts and fears that had once threatened to consume him now felt distant, replaced by the vibrant pulse of community and purpose. The journey was far from over, but the power of connection had illuminated the path forward. Back in the quiet of his garage, Frank touched the glowing prototype and whispered, "Thank you." The tunnel had come alive, not just with light and sound, but with the warmth of countless lives intertwined. And in that, Frank found a legacy far greater than he had ever imagined. Frank never anticipated how harsh a setback could feel until the day the funding fell through. It started with an unexpected email from the foundation that had been supporting their work for months, a message curt and final, citing shifting priorities and budget cuts. Frank stared at the screen, disbelief and a sinking feeling twisting inside him. Without that crucial support, many of their upcoming workshops and expansions would stall. The timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the project was gaining momentum, just as new partnerships blossomed, the rug was pulled out from under them. The weight of responsibility pressed down hard. He thought of the volunteers who counted on the resources, the seniors who found joy in the project, the kids who saw Frank as a beacon of possibility. How could he tell them the dream was slipping away? That night, the garage felt colder than ever. The glowing tunnel prototype flickered faintly as Frank sat alone, wrestling with a storm of emotions, disappointment, frustration, fear. For the first time since the journey began, doubt clawed at him with a fierce grip. Was this the end? Had age finally caught up, dragging his aspirations down with it? He remembered Elon Musk's own setbacks, failed rockets, near bankruptcy, relentless criticism. And yet Elon kept pushing forward, driven by a vision that refused to die. Could Frank find that same courage? The next day, Frank gathered Emily and Mason to share the news. Emily's eyes filled with tears, Mason clenched his fists. But they refused to give in to despair. Instead, they brainstormed fiercely, searching for new funding, alternative models, grassroots support. They reached out to local businesses, launched crowdfunding campaigns, and applied for smaller grants. The community rallied around them, holding fundraisers, volunteering time and skills. Frank was humbled by the outpouring of support but knew it wasn't enough to sustain long-term growth. A bitter truth settled in: passion alone could not replace the financial backing needed. One evening, after a long day of calls and meetings, Frank sat on the porch steps, staring into the darkening sky. He felt the sting of exhaustion, the ache of responsibility. But as the stars appeared, so did a quiet resolve. This setback was not a defeat but a challenge, a test of resilience and adaptability. The tunnel had always been about more than money or technology, it was about heart. That week, Frank wrote a candid blog post titled, "The Setback," finding strength in struggle, sharing the painful news but also calling on the community to unite, innovate, and persevere. The response was immediate and heartfelt. Stories of personal hardship and triumph flooded in, volunteers offered new ideas, and even skeptics expressed newfound respect for their tenacity. One message, from a man named Harold who had lost everything to illness but found solace in building tunnels with his grandchildren, struck Frank deeply. Harold's words reminded him that setbacks could breed unexpected growth, that sometimes the darkest moments preceded the brightest breakthroughs. Renewed by this perspective, Frank and his team pivoted, embracing a leaner, more flexible approach. They developed simpler kits, hosted pop-up workshops in parks and community centers, and leveraged social media to spread the message far and wide. The setback had forced them to become more creative and connected than ever. Months later, at a small gathering in the local library, Frank shared the story of the funding loss and the lessons it brought. His voice was steady, filled with humility and hope. "We have faced obstacles before and will face many more. But as long as we hold on to our vision and each other, no setback can stop us." The crowd erupted in applause, a testament to the power of perseverance. That night, Frank looked at the tunnel prototype, now patched and glowing with renewed vigor. It was imperfect, scarred by challenges, but alive. Like him. He whispered, "This setback is just part of the journey. And I'm still here." The road ahead remained uncertain, but Frank knew one thing for sure: giving up was not an option. Frank stood at the threshold of his garage, the soft hum of the tunnel prototype filling the air like a heartbeat. Months had passed since the setback, and though the journey had been rocky, something deep inside him had rekindled, a fire born not from success but from resilience. That morning, a letter arrived from an old friend, Sarah, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. She was reaching out with an invitation to speak at a local senior center about his work and the journey he had taken. Frank hesitated. Speaking publicly had never been easy, especially after the doubts and disappointments. But Sarah's words were encouraging: "Your story matters. People need to hear it." That night, Frank rehearsed in front of the mirror, voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. The next day, he entered the community hall, walls lined with framed photos and worn chairs filled with curious faces. The room smelled of coffee and old books, familiar and comforting. Frank began by sharing the moment it all changed, how a spark from Elon Musk's radical thinking had challenged his assumptions about aging and possibility. He spoke of regret, loneliness, and the struggle to find meaning in the later years of life. Then he told them about the breakthrough, the doubt, the connections, and the setbacks, the full arc of his journey without glossing over the hard parts. The audience listened, rapt, some nodding, others wiping tears. Afterward, a woman approached him, her eyes bright. "I've been feeling invisible since my husband passed. Hearing your story gave me hope that I'm not alone." Another man, a retired engineer, offered to volunteer to help with the workshops. Frank felt a swell of gratitude and purpose. The return to the community was more than a speaking engagement, it was a renewal of his commitment to connect, inspire, and grow. He realized that his own story, imperfect and raw, was a gift that could light a path for others. Over the next weeks, Frank expanded his outreach, partnering with other local organizations to bring the tunnel project into new spaces, libraries, senior centers, hospitals. Each visit deepened his understanding of the challenges and hopes of those he met. He found joy in the small victories, a smile, a spark of curiosity, a new friendship. One afternoon, while installing a new kit at a nursing home, Frank met Robert, a former aerospace technician who had once dreamed of building rockets but gave up when life's demands took over. They bonded over stories of invention and perseverance, and Robert soon became a key volunteer, bringing technical expertise and enthusiasm. Frank felt the circle of support widen. Through these encounters, Frank began to see that the tunnel was more than a project, it was a symbol of the enduring human spirit, a bridge between past dreams and future possibilities. He thought often of Elon Musk's fearless drive to push boundaries and disrupt the status quo. Inspired by this mindset, Frank pushed himself to innovate, creating new workshop formats that blended storytelling, hands-on building, and reflection. The community responded with excitement and engagement. Meanwhile, Emily launched a podcast series featuring interviews with seniors sharing their own return stories, moments when they reclaimed purpose or reconnected with forgotten passions. The podcast quickly gained listeners across the country, spreading the message far beyond Frank's town. The return had sparked a ripple effect. Yet, Frank remained grounded. He knew the journey was ongoing, filled with highs and lows. One evening, after a long day of workshops, he sat quietly in his garage, watching the tunnel glow softly. He whispered, "I'm back. And this time, I'm here to stay." The return was not just about going back, it was about moving forward with renewed courage, connection, and vision. Frank felt ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing that age was no barrier but a source of strength. And in that moment, the tunnel's light seemed to shine a little brighter, reflecting the fire within him. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, like the first ray of sunlight piercing through a stormy sky. Frank had been tinkering late into the night, adjusting the tunnel's wiring and refining the prototype's design. His hands moved with a steady rhythm, decades of experience guiding each movement, but the fatigue of countless setbacks weighed heavily. Suddenly, a soft beep echoed from the control panel, followed by a cascade of lights illuminating the tunnel's interior in vibrant colors. Frank's heart leapt. After months of trial and error, the tunnel was no longer just a symbol or a project, it was alive, responsive, and ready to fulfill its purpose. The breakthrough wasn't merely technical, it was deeply personal. It validated every moment of struggle, every doubt faced, every small step forward. Frank called Emily and Mason into the garage, their eyes widening in awe as the tunnel shimmered with light and sound. Together, they watched as the prototype's sensors detected movement, adapting the experience to the user's pace and mood. The tunnel became a portal not just of passage but of transformation, offering an immersive journey that stimulated memory, creativity, and connection. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through their growing community. Invitations came from senior centers, tech groups, and even local media eager to share the story of the tunnel that was changing lives. Frank found himself at the center of a movement that transcended age and circumstance. The breakthrough brought a new sense of possibility, inspiring him to push further. He collaborated with Robert and other volunteers to develop workshops where participants could customize their own tunnels, blending technology with personal stories and artistic expression. These workshops became safe spaces for healing, learning, and empowerment. One day, during a session at a community center, a participant named Linda shared how the tunnel experience helped her reconnect with memories of her late husband, stirring emotions long buried. Tears flowed freely as others nodded, recognizing their own journeys reflected in hers. Frank realized that the true power of the breakthrough was its ability to create emotional bridges, connecting past and present, loss and hope, isolation and belonging. Inspired by this insight, Frank wrote a heartfelt blog post titled, "The Breakthrough Within," inviting readers to embrace their own moments of transformation, however small or quiet they might be. The post resonated widely, sparking conversations across social media and beyond. Despite the excitement, Frank remained grounded in humility and gratitude. He knew the breakthrough was not an endpoint but a stepping stone. Challenges still awaited, technical refinements, funding needs, and the ongoing work of community building. But now, he faced them armed with renewed energy and the knowledge that meaningful change was possible at any stage of life. Elon Musk's voice echoed in Frank's mind, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." Frank embraced this mindset fully, welcoming each setback as part of the creative process. As summer turned to fall, Frank organized a showcase event where community members presented their personalized tunnels, sharing stories of growth and hope. The room buzzed with excitement and pride. Frank watched as seniors, children, and volunteers celebrated together, united by the shared journey. In that moment, the breakthrough felt complete. Not just a technical success but a collective triumph of spirit. That night, back in his quiet garage, Frank touched the glowing tunnel and smiled. The light reflected the journey within, the trials, the doubts, the connections, and now, the breakthrough. He whispered, "This is just the beginning." And with that, he stepped boldly into the future he had dared to imagine. Frank never imagined that his journey would lead to a gift so profound it transcended any material reward. It came on a crisp autumn morning, just as the leaves outside his garage began to turn fiery shades of orange and red. He was preparing for another workshop when a neatly wrapped package arrived from an unexpected source. A letter inside bore the signature of a prominent foundation that had once declined to fund the project. The letter acknowledged the breakthrough Frank and his team had achieved and expressed a renewed commitment to support their vision, not with just money but with resources to expand nationwide. The gift was more than financial backing, it was a validation of years of persistence, risk, and belief in the impossible. Frank felt a rush of emotion, remembering the long nights, the moments of doubt, and the encouragement drawn from Elon Musk's relentless spirit. But even more powerful than the letter was the realization that the greatest gift he could offer was the community they had built, the lives touched, the connections forged, the hope rekindled. That day's workshop was electric with possibility. Volunteers from nearby towns arrived early, eager to help distribute new kits and organize events. Frank saw familiar faces in the crowd, their eyes shining with renewed purpose. Children laughed as they assembled tunnels with grandparents, and seniors shared stories with volunteers, creating a mosaic of shared experiences. Frank took a moment to look around, feeling the warmth of belonging and the power of collective effort. He knew this was the true gift, the knowledge that age was no barrier to creating, connecting, and inspiring. As the sun dipped low, Frank stood before the group and spoke from the heart. "This gift is not just for me but for all of us who refuse to accept limitations. It's a testament to what can happen when we dare to believe in ourselves and each other." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing like a chorus of hope. Later, as the evening settled, Frank received a message from Mason, who had been coordinating outreach efforts. Mason shared stories from participants who had overcome isolation, rekindled old passions, or found new friendships through the tunnel project. Each story was a thread in the tapestry of transformation they had woven together. Frank reflected on how the journey mirrored Elon Musk's own path, marked by vision, setbacks, breakthroughs, and an unwavering belief in what was possible. He realized that the gift he had been given was not just support but a responsibility, to continue pushing boundaries, nurturing community, and inspiring others to find their own spark. That night, in the quiet glow of the tunnel prototype, Frank whispered, "This gift is for all who dare to dream, to change, and to live fully, no matter their age. And with that, he felt a deep peace settle within, knowing that the best was yet to come. Frank stood quietly in his garage, the soft glow of the tunnel prototype casting gentle shadows around him. The journey that had once seemed impossible now stretched out behind him like a winding road marked with triumphs, setbacks, and transformation. At 68 years old, Frank felt the weight of years not as a burden but as a tapestry of experiences that had shaped him into the man he was today. The project that began as a flicker of inspiration from Elon Musk's fearless mindset had blossomed into a movement. One that transcended technology to touch hearts, bridge generations, and redefine what it meant to grow older. As Frank reflected, he thought back to the moment it all changed, the question that ignited the fire: what if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That question had propelled him out of despair and into a life of purpose and connection. Now, surrounded by volunteers, friends, and family, Frank saw the new legacy taking shape. It was not built of fame or fortune but of shared stories, reclaimed dreams, and the courage to keep moving forward. During the community celebration held at the town's park, laughter and music filled the air. Children played alongside seniors, building tunnels that symbolized not just passageways but pathways to new beginnings. Frank watched as Emily spoke to a group of young volunteers about the power of persistence and kindness. Mason was coordinating a virtual workshop with participants from across the country, his enthusiasm infectious. The movement had become a living, breathing force fueled by collective hope and action. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank stood on a small stage to share his closing thoughts. His voice was steady but tender as he addressed the crowd. "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again. This journey has taught me that age is not a cage but a key to unlock new doors, to rewrite stories, and to build legacies that endure." He paused, looking out over the faces glowing with understanding and inspiration. Our stories matter. Our dreams matter. And together, we can light the way for others who feel lost or forgotten. The applause that followed was not just for Frank but for everyone who had dared to believe in the impossible. That night, back in his quiet garage, Frank touched the glowing tunnel one last time and smiled. The light inside was steady and strong, a beacon of hope for all who sought transformation. He whispered softly, "This is not the end. It's a new beginning." With that, Frank stepped into the future with courage and grace, carrying a legacy not of the past but of endless possibility. Age had not defined him, purpose had. And that was a truth worth sharing for generations to come. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?